In the years following the First World War, the world's great powers tried to avoid another cataclysm. But the Treaty of Versailles left Germany humiliated and economically crippled. The Great Depression deepened misery across Europe, and new ideological movements flourished. Fascist regimes in Italy and Germany, claiming that democracy was weak and communism was a threat, promised national revival through strength. In Japan, militarists rose to power during the 1930s and began to exert control over the government, arguing that the empire needed resources and living space to survive. Meanwhile, Britain and France, exhausted and haunted by memories of the trenches, adopted a policy of appeasement toward Hitler. They allowed Germany to remilitarize the Rhineland, absorb Austria, and dismember Czechoslovakia in the Munich Agreement of 1938 in the hope that concessions would prevent war. Far from pacifying Hitler, appeasement convinced him that the Western powers lacked the will to act. The illusion of peace evaporated on the 1st of September 1939 when German troops crossed into Poland. The invasion was preceded by a cynical propaganda campaign in which Nazi operatives staged a fake Polish attack on a German radio station to provide a pretext for war. At dawn, German forces launched a massive assault. More than 2,000 tanks, supported by nearly 900 bombers and over 400 fighter planes, hammered Polish positions. 60 divisions, about 1.5 million soldiers swept in from East Prussia and Silesia. The Polish army, short of modern armor and with only 300 outdated aircraft, fought bravely but was outmatched. On the 17th of September, Soviet forces invaded from the east, sealing Poland's fate. By early October, the last Polish units laid down their arms, and Germany and the Soviet Union partitioned the country. Poland became the first victim of a war that would soon engulf the world. The German victories that followed were astonishing. In April 1940, under the pretext of protecting Scandinavia from Allied aggression, German forces occupied Denmark and launched landings along the Norwegian coast. Norway resisted, but the Germans seized key ports, including Narvik and Oslo, and installed a puppet government under Vidkun Quisling. Control of Norway secured Germany's iron ore shipments and gave the Kriegsmarine new bases from which to operate. A month later, on the 10th of May 1940, the Blitzkrieg rolled west into the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. German armored divisions smashed through the Ardennes forest and crossed the Meuse River, bypassing the Maginot Line. The speed and coordination of the attack stunned Allied commanders. Within days, French, Belgian, and British armies were in chaos. The Dutch surrendered after the bombing of Rotterdam. The Belgians capitulated following the encirclement of their forces at the River Lys. In France, the government collapsed. Millions of civilians fled south in what became known as the Exode. Amid this turmoil, one of the war's most dramatic events unfolded on the beaches of Dunkirk. British expeditionary forces and the remnants of the French army found themselves trapped between German forces and the sea. Admiral Bertram Ramsay devised Operation Dynamo to rescue them. From the 26th of May to the 4th of June 1940, destroyers, merchant ships, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, and ferries crossed the English Channel again and again under constant air attack. Over 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated, roughly one-third of them French. More than 800 vessels took part, a testament to the improvisation and determination of civilians and sailors. The RAF fought over the beaches, shooting down German bombers and fighters to shield the evacuation. although around 90,000 men were captured, and most of the British expeditionary force as heavy equipment was abandoned. Dunkirk was hailed as a miracle. It enabled Britain to fight on and provided a rallying cry for a nation that refused to surrender. France's agony did not end at Dunkirk. German troops continued south, encircling French armies and occupying Paris on the 14th of June. Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of the First World War, now headed a new French government. He sought an armistice and, on the 22nd of June 1940, signed terms with Germany that divided the country into an occupied zone and a nominally independent state, headquartered at Vichy. The Vichy regime collaborated with the Nazi occupiers, while General Charles de Gaulle, broadcasting from London, called upon French soldiers to continue the fight from the colonies. Britain, isolated but defiant, faced the prospect of invasion. Hitler prepared Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious assault on southern England. For it to succeed, the Luftwaffe had to destroy Britain's air defenses. In July 1940, German bombers and fighters attacked Channel convoys and coastal targets, probing British responses. They then shifted to destroying RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. RAF Fighter Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, deployed Hurricanes and Spitfires to intercept the waves of incoming aircraft. Ground observers and the newly built chain of radar stations, part of the integrated Dowding system, provided early warning that allowed the RAF to scramble its outnumbered squadrons. By September, the Luftwaffe turned to bombing London and other cities in the mistaken belief that civilian terror would force Britain to capitulate. The change in strategy gave the RAF time to repair airfields and rebuild squadrons. British pilots, supplemented by volunteers from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, New Zealand, and other nations, fought with extraordinary courage. More than 544 RAF pilots were killed, while German losses totaled about 2,500 aircrew. Despite heavy bombing, Britain did not yield. The Battle of Britain ended with Hitler's abandonment of the invasion plan. Prime Minister Winston Churchill paid tribute to the airmen. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. While Britain endured, the war spread to the Mediterranean and Balkans. In October 1940, Mussolini ordered an ill-fated invasion of Greece from Albania. Greek forces counter-attacked and drove the Italians back. Hitler, worried that the Balkans might become a springboard for a British attack, intervened in April 1941. German troops overran Yugoslavia and Greece in a matter of weeks. On the island of Crete, elite German paratroopers seized airfields but suffered heavy casualties. The campaign drew Hitler further into the Mediterranean and delayed preparations for his main objective, the invasion of the Soviet Union. By the spring of 1941, the Axis position in North Africa appeared promising. Italy's initial invasion of Egypt had been repulsed by British Commonwealth forces, who then pushed deep into Libya. But in February, Hitler dispatched Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Corps to rescue his ally. Rommel counter-attacked, retaking much of Cyrenaica and besieging the port of Tobruk. The Desert War sawed back and forth for months, straining supply lines across the Mediterranean. Control of the sea lanes was vital. The Royal Navy, operating from Alexandria and Malta, battled Italian battleships and German U-boats. Malta, subjected to intensive air bombardment and blockaded, nevertheless served as a key base for disrupting Axis convoys. Axis troops also pushed into East Africa, where British, South African and Ethiopian forces expelled them by late 1941. These struggles showed that this truly was a global war, with battles raging from the Arctic Circle to the Horn of Africa. Even before Pearl Harbor, American support for the Allied cause was growing. President Franklin Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, allowing the United States to supply arms and equipment to nations whose defense was deemed vital to American interests. Convoys of merchant ships escorted by destroyers began transporting tanks, aircraft, and food across the Atlantic to Britain and the Soviet Union. In August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met off the coast of Newfoundland and issued the Atlantic Charter, setting out common principles for the post-war world: self-determination, free trade, and the abandonment of territorial conquest. Though still neutral, America was edging ever closer to war. In the North Atlantic, U-boats hunted Allied shipping. On the 31st of October 1941, the USS Reuben James, a U.S. destroyer escorting a convoy, was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine, killing 115 sailors. The attack underscored how dangerous the Atlantic had become. While British eyes were fixed on the Channel and Mediterranean, events in Eastern Europe would determine the fate of Nazi Germany. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union stemmed from ideological hatred of communism and a desire for living space. He believed a short, decisive campaign would destroy the Soviet Union before the United States could enter the war. Operation Barbarossa began on the 22nd of June 1941, with the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. More than 3 million German soldiers and 650,000 troops from Italy, Romania, Hungary, and Finland. The invasion proceeded along 3 axes: north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south toward Ukraine. German armor achieved spectacular encirclements. At Minsk and Smolensk, hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops were taken prisoner. In September, they surrounded Kiev, capturing nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers. German ideology framed the war as one of annihilation. Following behind the front lines, Einsatzgruppen death squads murdered Jewish communities and political commissars. Soviet civilians suffered immensely as villages were burned and food seized. Yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin had relocated factories east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of Luftwaffe bombers. Though the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses, some 4 million casualties by December 1941, it absorbed the blows and learned. Soviet workers produced tanks, guns, and aircraft in enormous numbers, many financed through Lend-Lease. Winter cut short the German advance. Snow and mud bogged down vehicles. Fuel and ammunition failed to reach the front. At Moscow, fresh Siberian divisions counterattacked, driving the Germans back and marking the first major land defeat for Hitler's armies. In the north, German forces encircled Leningrad, intending to starve the city into submission. Over nearly 900 days, the inhabitants endured bombardment and severe rationing. An estimated 800,000 civilians died. Nonetheless, supplies reached the city across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga during winter, and the population refused to give in. Barbarossa ended not with German victory, but with exhaustion and stalemate. While Europe fought for survival, Imperial Japan pressed its own ambitions across Asia. The Japanese army had occupied Manchuria since 1931 and had plunged into central China in 1937, committing atrocities in Nanjing and other cities. In 1940, Japan signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, creating the Axis alliance. When the United States and Britain imposed oil and scrap metal embargoes in response to Japan's aggression, the Japanese leadership concluded that war with the Western powers was inevitable. They conceived a plan to seize Southeast Asian colonies rich in oil and rubber while neutralizing the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In the early hours of the 7th of December 1941, waves of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Dive bombers and torpedo planes descended on Battleship Row, ripping through the decks of the USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and others. Within minutes, the harbor was a scene of flames and capsized hulls. In just under 2 hours, 8 U.S. battleships were sunk or badly damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and 3,435 American servicemen killed or wounded. The attack failed to hit America's aircraft carriers, which were out at sea, but it decimated the battle line. Japanese forces simultaneously struck the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Guam, and Wake Island. Washington declared war on Japan the next day, and soon Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, transforming a European war into a true world war. Japan's offensive rolled on through the winter of 1941-42. On the same day Pearl Harbor burned, Japanese aircraft torpedoed the British battleships Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse off the coast of Malaya, sinking both with the loss of 840 sailors. The fall of Hong Kong on Christmas Day and the collapse of British defenses in Malaya exposed the vulnerability of European colonies. On the island of Luzon in the Philippines, American and Filipino forces withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. Across Southeast Asia, the Japanese seized the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, capturing oil fields vital to their war effort. They pushed into Burma, threatening India and the supply route to China, known as the Burma Road. In Singapore, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival had been confident that the city's coastal guns and 80,000 troops could hold off any attack. But Japanese forces crossed the Johor Strait, captured reservoirs and high ground, and assaulted from the landward side. Many of Singapore's guns, designed to fire out to sea, could not be turned inland. On the 15th of February, 1942, Percival surrendered the garrison. About 85,000 British, Australian and Indian soldiers laid down their arms to fewer than 35,000 Japanese. The Japanese had more than 200 tanks and 600 aircraft. Their opponents possessed only 23 tanks and 158 aircraft. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. Not all the news was grim. Barely 4 months after Pearl Harbor, a small group of American aviators struck back. The Doolittle raid, launched from the carrier USS Hornet in April 1942, demonstrated U.S. ingenuity. 16 B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, lifted off from the carrier deck after months of training. Their mission was audacious: bomb the Japanese mainland and then fly on to China. Forced to launch earlier than planned, they dropped incendiaries and high explosives on Tokyo, Kobe, Nagoya, and other targets. The material damage was minimal, but the raid shattered Japan's sense of invulnerability and boosted Allied morale. Of the 75 aviators involved, 3 died in crashes and 8 were captured. The remainder returned with the help of Chinese civilians. The psychological effect on Japanese leaders was significant. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, resolved to eliminate the U.S. carrier threat. The first carrier versus carrier battle in history occurred a month later in the Coral Sea. Japanese forces, aiming to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea and sever communications with Australia, were intercepted by an Allied task force. For 2 days, aircraft from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown dueled with planes from Shokaku and Zuikaku. The Americans sank the light carrier Sho and damaged Shokaku severely. Heavy losses among Zuikaku's air group prevented it from participating in the next major battle. In return, the U.S. lost the carrier Lexington and a support ship. Tactically, it was a draw, but strategically, the battle forced Japan to abandon its southward thrust and saved Port Moresby. It also taught both sides valuable lessons in carrier warfare and set the stage for the next confrontation. Midway, 2,000 miles northwest of Hawaii, would determine the course of the Pacific War. U.S. codebreakers had decrypted Japanese communications and discovered that a fifth referred to Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared an ambush by deploying Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. On the 4th of June 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft bombed Midway's airfields and installations, hoping to draw out the U.S. fleet. American torpedo squadrons from the carriers Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown attacked courageously but were wiped out by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Their sacrifice, however, pulled the combat air patrol down. At that critical moment, U.S. dive bombers arrived overhead. In minutes, they set the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu ablaze. Hiryu launched a counterstrike that seriously damaged Yorktown, but she too was destroyed later that day. After the battle, Japan had lost 4 carriers, a cruiser, and more than 3,000 sailors, compared with American losses of 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and roughly 362 personnel. Midway marked the end of Japanese expansion and gave the United States an offensive footing. With the Japanese on the defensive, Allied strategy shifted to a 2-pronged approach. In the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur planned to return to the Philippines via New Guinea and the Dutch East Indies. In the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz directed a leapfrog campaign across atolls and islands, capturing key positions to build airfields and naval bases. The first test came at Guadalcanal. On the 7th of August, 1942, U.S. Marines stormed ashore to seize an airstrip the Japanese were building. The ensuing campaign lasted 6 months and involved 7 naval battles, hundreds of air engagements, and grueling ground combat. Disease and hunger claimed as many lives as bullets. By February 1943, the Japanese admitted defeat and evacuated 12,000 remaining troops. The toll was horrendous. The United States lost about 7,100 men, 29 ships, and 615 aircraft. Japan lost approximately 31,000 men, 38 ships, and 683 aircraft. Guadalcanal proved that Allied forces could wrest territory from Japan and hold it. It also marked the first time the Japanese Naval High Command conceded control of an area without a decisive battle, a turning point in Japanese doctrine. As 1942 drew to a close, the World War had broadened to an almost unimaginable scale. German armies occupied most of continental Europe and still advanced deep into the Soviet Union, but their momentum had stalled. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps was increasingly stretched and under attack from British and Commonwealth forces. Soon American troops would land in Morocco and Algeria. In the Atlantic, convoys of merchant ships raced to deliver supplies while German U-boats hunted them relentlessly. In Asia, Japan's empire stretched from Burma and Malaya to the Solomon Islands. Yet the United States had checked its advance and inflicted crippling losses at Midway and Guadalcanal. Tens of millions of civilians were caught in the maelstrom, their homes destroyed, their lives upended. Factories in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union worked around the clock to produce tanks, planes, and munitions. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, keeping economies running while men fought overseas. Scientists and engineers developed new technologies like radar, code-breaking machines, and improved aircraft. 1942 ended with a grim realization: the war would not be short. Harder battles lay ahead in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Philippines, the Mariana Islands, at Stalingrad and Kursk, El Alamein and Kasserine Pass. Yet the events of 1939–42 had already set the course. The Axis powers no longer held the initiative. The Allies had endured the storm, learned bitter lessons, and begun to strike back. The outcome of the Second World War hung in the balance, but the tide was beginning to turn. By the beginning of 1942, the global conflict launched by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had become a conflagration engulfing every inhabited continent. On land and at sea, the Axis powers seemed dominant. Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened the Suez Canal. German divisions occupied vast tracts of the Soviet Union, and Japanese armies had pushed south through Malaya into Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Yet beneath the surface of Axis triumph lay cracks. In North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Soviet Union, and the vast Pacific, Allied nations marshaled their resources, honed their strategies, and prepared for a counter-offensive that would turn defeat into victory. What followed from 1942 to 1945 was a series of campaigns that reshaped the war and the world beyond it. In North Africa, the early months of 1942 saw Axis and Allied forces locked in a brutal tug-of-war. Italian ambitions to control the region had already been challenged by British victories in 1940–41. But General Erwin Rommel's arrival with his Afrika Korps changed the dynamic. Rommel, dubbed the Desert Fox, combined daring maneuvers with a ruthless exploitation of Allied weaknesses. His lightning strikes in early 1942 pushed British and Commonwealth troops east toward Egypt. At Gazala that May, his tanks swept around British positions and smashed the desert flank. A month later, Tobruk fell, dealing a severe blow to Allied morale. Yet Rommel's successes masked his vulnerability. Stretched supply lines across the Mediterranean, limited fuel and replacement tanks, and an opponent learning to adapt. Under the leadership of Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, the British Eighth Army reorganized, trained intensively, and built up a powerful force of men and materiel. Montgomery's preparations culminated at El Alamein. In July 1942, his army halted Rommel's advance at the First Battle of El Maine. 3 months later, on a moonless night in October, Montgomery launched a meticulously planned counteroffensive. Waves of infantry advanced behind a thunderous artillery barrage, while combat engineers cleared lanes through Axis minefields nicknamed the Devil's Ardens. For 12 days the two sides grappled. When Rommel withdrew on the 4th of November, his armored reserves shattered and fuel nearly exhausted, the tide had turned. Churchill hailed El Alamein as the end of the beginning, sensing that a strategic shift was underway. It would be cemented by a second hammer blow from the west. On the 8th of November 1942, Allied forces under U.S. General Dwight Eisenhower launched Operation Torch. More than 100,000 American and British troops landed simultaneously at 3 points along the Atlantic coast of French, North Africa, near Casablanca in Morocco, and near Oran and Algiers in Algeria. The aim was to seize these ports and then sweep east to trap Rommel between Montgomery's pursuing 8th Army and a new army arriving from the west. Torch was the first large-scale Anglo-American amphibious operation of the war. It required complex coordination among naval, air, and ground forces and delicate diplomacy with Vichy French commanders, some of whom resisted fiercely before agreeing to a ceasefire. Once the beaches were secured, Eisenhower's troops raced east across the deserts of Algeria and Tunisia. They soon encountered veteran German units, and in February 1943, inexperienced American formations suffered a painful lesson at the Kasserine Pass, where poor coordination and aggressive German tactics inflicted heavy casualties. But Allied commanders learned from the setback, reorganizing supply and command structures and integrating U.S. units more closely with British armor and artillery. By March, the noose tightened around Axis forces in Tunisia. Montgomery's 8th Army drove west from Libya, while Eisenhower's reorganized army advanced east. In April, Allied aircraft severed sea lanes to Tunisia, and German and Italian troops found themselves starved of supplies. The final battles were fierce, but by May, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms, the largest mass surrender of German troops in Stalingrad. North Africa was liberated, and the Mediterranean Sea was open as a highway for Allied operations. Victory in Africa opened the door to Europe's soft underbelly. Allied strategists debated whether to cross directly into France or to assault Italy first. They opted for the latter, reasoning that Italy as withdrawal would weaken Germany and provide a jumping-off point for a future invasion of southern France. On the night of the 9th to the 10th of July 1943, under cover of darkness and pre-dawn rain, more than 3,000 ships approached the island of Sicily. Operation Husky, the largest amphibious invasion to date, landed roughly 150,000 troops on the island's southeastern shores, supported by over 4,000 aircraft and countless gliders and paratroopers. Misdrops and high winds scattered airborne forces across the island, but the beach landings met light opposition as Italian coastal divisions crumbled. The 2 German divisions on the island fought hard, conducting skillful delaying actions. As Allied divisions pushed inland, they contended with narrow roads, heat and dust, and tenacious rearguard actions in hilltop towns. The political consequences were swift. Benito Mussolini, whose bombastic rhetoric had promised a new Roman Empire stretching across Africa and the Mediterranean, found himself blamed for Italy's failures. On the 24th of July, the Fascist Grand Council voted to depose him. King Victor Emmanuel III placed him under arrest. Marshal Pietro Badoglio assumed control and opened secret talks with the Allies. Meanwhile, German High Command, anticipating Italy's collapse, rushed reinforcements to northern and central Italy, establishing defensive lines and seizing control of major cities. The Germans succeeded in evacuating more than 100,000 troops and thousands of vehicles from Sicily across the Strait of Messina. But the Allies now occupied an island that dominated sea lanes and offered airfields within striking distance of mainland Italy. Mussolini's fall signaled that one leg of the Axis tripod was cracking. The slog up the Italian peninsula proved far more arduous than planners had hoped. Allied troops landed near Salerno on the 9th of September 1943, expecting light resistance. But German forces quickly counter-attacked, pushing some units to the brink of being driven back into the sea. Only naval gunfire support and dogged infantry defense held the line until reinforcements arrived. To complicate matters, a separate landing further south encountered little opposition, and Allied soldiers marched unopposed into Taranto, Brindisi, and Bari. As Allied armies regrouped, Badoglio's government announced that Italy would leave the Axis, though German forces quickly disarmed Italian units and took control. Over the next months, the Germans fought a series of delaying actions along successive defensive belts, the Volcherno Line, the Barber Line, and finally the Gustav Line, anchored on the Rapido River and the heights of Monte Cassino. The battles for Cassino were among the most grueling of the war in the West. From January to May 1944, Allied armies, including British, American, French, Indian, New Zealand, and Polish troops, launched 4 assaults against the German positions. The defenders, drawn from elite paratroops and mountain units, used the high ground and robust stone walls to devastating effect. Rain and mud hampered tank movement. Mines and machine gun nests inflicted heavy casualties. On the 15th of February, 1944, Allied bombers demolished the ancient Benedictine Abbey at the summit of Monte Cassino. The destruction outraged many around the world and, as it turned out, gave German paratroopers an even stronger defensive position among the ruins. When the Gustav Line finally cracked on the 18th of May, the cost was high, around 55,000 Allied casualties and about 20,000 German losses. Meanwhile, an amphibious landing at Anzio in January 1944 aimed to bypass the Gustav Line and threaten Rome from the rear. However, cautious leadership allowed the Germans time to contain the beachhead, and the fighting devolved into a static siege that lasted until May. On the 4th of June, 1944, Allied troops entered Rome, the Eternal City, largely spared the devastation inflicted upon other European capitals, greeted liberators with bells and cheers. Italy would remain a battlefield as German forces withdrew north to the Gothic Line in the Apennines, and fighting continued into 1945. Nevertheless, the fall of Rome struck a symbolic blow. News of its liberation was fleeting, however, as global attention shifted 2 days later to the beaches of Normandy. Far from the Mediterranean, the Eastern Front remained the conflict's most ferocious theater. After the initial successes of Operation Barbarossa, Germany found itself embroiled in a war of attrition against a nation of immense resources and a people determined to defend their homeland at any cost. By mid-1942, Hitler had turned his attention to the south, seeking to seize oil fields in the Caucasus and to capture the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The battle that ensued was a nightmare of close-quarter combat, hunger, and cold. German Sixth Army troops fought street by street, using sewers and cellars to inch forward. Soviet soldiers, under orders not to yield a meter, clung to positions among the smashed factories and grain elevators. The Volga became a lifeline, with barges ferrying reinforcements and evacuating wounded under constant shell fire. In November 1942, Marshal Georgy Zhukov struck back. 2 massive Soviet pincer movements swept around Stalingrad, encircling more than 250,000 Axis troops. Hitler forbade a breakout, promising that airlifts would resupply the pocket. The Luftwaffe, already overstretched, could not deliver enough food, fuel, or ammunition. Temperatures plunged below zero, frostbite and disease ran rampant, and Soviet artillery pounded German positions. On the 2nd of February 1943, after weeks of futile attempts to break the ring, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the remnants of the Sixth Army. Of the more than 330,000 soldiers who had entered the battle, barely a third would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad marked the turning of the Eastern Front, shattering the myth of German invincibility and proving that the Red Army could not only defend, but destroy a major German force. The fighting did not end there. In July 1943, German forces launched one more great offensive at Kursk, aiming to pinch off a bulge in the Soviet lines and regain the initiative. The Soviets, forewarned, constructed deep defensive belts of trenches, barbed wire, and minefields. When the Germans attacked on the 5th of July, their armor rolled into a storm of artillery fire. At Prokhorovka on the 12th of July, hundreds of tanks collided at point-blank range in one of history's largest armored clashes. After weeks of grinding combat, the Germans called off the attack. The Red Army seized the initiative and began pushing west. 1 year later, on the 3rd anniversary of the invasion, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration. This offensive shattered German Army Group Center in Belarus, destroyed roughly 30 divisions, and inflicted around 450,000 casualties. The Soviet advance cut through vast swaths of territory, liberating cities like Minsk and Vilnius, and rolling into Poland. Despite suffering over 770,000 casualties of their own, Soviet forces pushed relentlessly onward. By early 1945, they stood on the Oder River, within striking distance of Berlin. German resistance stiffened. Desperate counterattacks around Lake Balaton and along the Oder tried to slow the juggernaut. But shortages of fuel, ammunition, and manpower were fatal. In April 1945, the Red Army encircled Berlin. Street fighting raged for 2 weeks as Soviet troops fought building by building toward the Reichstag. On the 30th of April, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Berlin fell on the 2nd of May. German commanders signed their unconditional surrender on the 7th to the 8th of May 1945, bringing to a close 12 years of Nazi rule. Even as battles raged in Italy and the Soviet Union, Allied leaders prepared to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall and open a second front in northwestern Europe. Planning for Operation Overlord began in earnest in 1943. The operation required building an entire invasion force in England, deceiving German intelligence into believing the landings would occur near Calais, and developing technology such as amphibious tanks, armored bulldozers, floating harbors and fuel pipelines across the Channel. Allied bombers and fighters hammered French railways and airfields to isolate the battlefield. On the night of the 5th to the 6th of June 1944, thousands of paratroopers and glider infantry leapt into the darkness over Normandy. Their mission: seize bridges, disrupt communications, and delay German reinforcements. In the early dawn, amphibious craft ferried tens of thousands of soldiers to beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Utah was lightly defended. Omaha, however, became a slaughterhouse. Strong currents scattered landing craft, and soldiers waded ashore through withering machine gun and artillery fire. Casualties were heavy in the first hours, but small groups fought their way up the bluffs, silencing guns and clearing exits. By the end of the day, more than 150,000 Allied troops were ashore and holding a precarious lodgment. Engineers constructed artificial harbors known as mulberries, allowing vehicles and supplies to pour across the beaches. A pipeline under the ocean Project Pluto began pumping fuel from England. In the coming weeks, American forces captured the port of Cherbourg. British and Canadian forces fought through the bocage to Caen, and the Allied buildup continued unabated. Breaking out of Normandy required new tactics. Hedgerow country slowed tank movement and made artillery fire less effective. In late July, the Allies unleashed Operation Cobra, a massive carpet bombing by hundreds of American 17s and B-24s pulverized German positions, creating a gap through which armored divisions poured. The German front collapsed. Remnants fell back through narrow corridors around Falaise. Here, an Allied pincer encircled tens of thousands of German troops. Many escaped, but much of Germany's equipment in France was lost. Paris rose in insurrection, and on the 25th of August, the city was liberated by French forces under General Leclerc alongside U.S. troops. American and British armies advanced rapidly toward Belgium and the Netherlands. Ports like Antwerp were seized to improve logistics. In September, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery attempted an audacious airborne thrust into the Netherlands' Operation Market Garden. Thousands of paratroopers seized bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, but the final objective at Arnhem proved too ambitious. Delayed ground forces and unexpectedly strong German resistance turned the operation into a costly setback. Despite this, the Allies continued to grind toward Germany's borders. Winter brought Hitler's last great gamble in the West. On the 16th of December 1944, German divisions smashed into the thinly held Ardennes forest in Belgium, aiming to split Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. Poor weather grounded Allied aircraft, allowing German tanks to surge forward. American units, including the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, held key crossroads despite being surrounded. Reinforcements rushed in as skies cleared and Allied planes strafed advancing columns. After several weeks of fierce fighting, the bulge created in Allied lines was eliminated. In March 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. German plans to destroy. Bridges failed when U.S. troops captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact on the 7th of March, allowing a sudden crossing and rapid expansion of the bridgehead. Further south, on the 22nd of March, the U.S. Third Army crossed near Oppenheim. Within 48 hours, 4 American divisions were across. The American 7th Army crossed near Worms on the 26th of March. British and Canadian forces crossed in the north. Once east of the river, Allied armies advanced swiftly through Germany. The Ruhr industrial region was encircled. Cities fell in rapid succession as German units surrendered or retreated. By April, American troops liberated concentration camps such as Buchenwald and Dachau, uncovering the horrors of the Holocaust. On the 25th of April at Torgau on the Elbe River, American and Soviet troops met and celebrated their shared victory. The Western Allies paused to allow the Soviets to take Berlin, then accepted Germany's unconditional surrender in early May. While Europe consumed enormous resources and attention, the war in the Pacific continued to rage with equal intensity. After their success at Guadalcanal, American and Allied forces embraced a strategy of island hopping. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held island, they would seize strategic bases, cut Japanese supply lines, and leave garrisons to wither on the vine. This approach required mastery of amphibious assaults, naval air power, and logistical support across thousands of miles of ocean. The first test of the new strategy came at Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. On the 20th of November 1943, an armada of battleships, carriers and transports arrived off the coral atoll of Betio. Low tides and miscalculations left many amphibious tractors stranded on reefs hundreds of yards from shore. Marines waited in waist-deep water under a storm of machine gun fire. For 3 days they fought from shell hole to pillbox. By the end of the 76-hour battle, nearly 1,000 Marines and 30 sailors were dead, 88 Marines missing, and more than 2,200 wounded. Japanese casualties approached total annihilation. The carnage shocked the American public, but taught commanders invaluable lessons about tides, pre-invasion bombardment, and the need for better amphibious vehicles. After Tarawa, U.S. forces stormed the Marshalls and Carolines. At Kwajalein and in Inwaitak in early 1944, they perfected the art of pre-assault bombardment and rapid troop landings. In June, they attacked Saipan in the Marianas, a battle that would have repercussions in Tokyo. Saipan offered airfields from which B-29 superfortresses could strike the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Navy responded with a fleet that attempted to ambush the invasion fleet. The ensuing carrier battle of the Philippine Sea became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as U.S. naval aviators shot down hundreds of Japanese planes at the cost of relatively few American losses. Saipan fell after weeks of bitter fighting. Its capture prompted the fall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government. Nearby Tinian and Guam soon followed, providing additional air bases. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines, wading ashore at Leyte with the declaration, "I have returned." That same month, the seas off Leyte saw one of the largest naval battles in history. The Japanese launched a complex plan to draw American carriers away and attack the invasion fleet. The Battle of Leyte Gulf comprised 4 separate engagements: the battles of the Sibuyan Sea, Surigao Strait, Cape Ingago, and off Samar. Japanese forces inflicted damage but lost much of their remaining carrier aviation, leaving them unable to contest American naval dominance. On land, fighting continued for months. At Manila in early 1945, house-to-house combat destroyed much of the city and inflicted enormous civilian casualties. Guerrilla fighters assisted U.S. troops in clearing the islands, and by the summer, the Philippines were largely liberated. The costliest battles still lay ahead. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island midway between the Marianas and Japan, was targeted. Because its airfields could serve as emergency landing strips for damaged B-29s and as a base for fighter escorts. On the 19th of February, 1945, 3 Marine divisions landed under cover of naval bombardment. The island's Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had constructed a honeycomb of tunnels and bunkers. Rather than defending the beaches, he withdrew his men inland. As Marines pushed up the slopes of the extinct volcano, hidden guns raked them with deadly accuracy. For 36 days, American forces fought for every yard of black sand and volcanic ash. Casualties were horrific. About 6,800 Marines killed and more than 19,000 wounded. Only a few hundred of the island's 21,000 defenders survived. The battle produced one of the most enduring photographs of the war, the raising of the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, symbolizing both a hard-won triumph and the grim cost of victory. Okinawa, the final stepping stone, dwarfed previous island battles. On Easter Sunday, the 1st of April 1945, more than 60,000 U.S. soldiers and Marines stormed ashore. At first, resistance was light. Japanese commanders under General Metsuru Sujima had chosen to fight from prepared positions in the south. As Allied troops advanced, they encountered interlocking networks of caves, pillboxes, and minefields. The Japanese concentrated their defense along a series of ridges named for their topography: Kakazu, Shuri, Sugarloaf. Rain turned the ground into sucking mud. Artillery duels shook the island day and night. Offshore, the Imperial Navy launched waves of kamikaze aircraft, crashing more than 1,000 planes into Allied ships. British carriers with armored decks weathered repeated strikes while providing fighter cover. The battle lasted nearly 3 months. At its end, U.S. casualties exceeded 49,000, including more than 12,000 dead. Japanese military losses were similar. Even before the battle for Okinawa ended, American B-29s based in the Marianas and on captured islands were incinerating Japanese cities with incendiary bombs. On the 9th to the 10th of March 1945, a firebombing raid on Tokyo killed more than 80,000 people and destroyed a quarter of the city. Yet Japan's militarist leaders showed no sign of surrender. The Manhattan Project, a secret wartime program involving thousands of scientists and engineers in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, had been racing to develop a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. On the 16th of July 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the world's first atomic bomb exploded at the Trinity test site, unleashing energy equal to about 21,000 tons of TNT and creating a blinding flash visible for miles. President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April, now faced a decision: continue conventional bombardment and blockade, prepare for an invasion, or employ the new bomb to compel surrender. The U.S. had already warned Japanese leaders in the Potsdam Declaration that failure to surrender would bring prompt and utter destruction. On the 6th of August 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released an atomic bomb over Hiroshima at 8:15 a.m. The bomb detonated hundreds of meters above the city, unleashing the equivalent of roughly 12.5 kilotons of TNT. A blinding light and blast wave flattened buildings over a radius of several miles. A firestorm raged through wooden homes. Tens of thousands were incinerated instantly. By the end of the week, an estimated 120,000 men, women, and children were dead. 3 days later, another B-29 boxcar dropped a second atomic device on Nagasaki. This bomb exploded with greater force, around 22 kilotons, but the city's topography limited destruction to roughly 2 square miles. About 73,000 people were killed. These attacks shocked Japan's leadership. At the same time, the Soviet Union, honoring its pledge at the Yalta Conference, declared war on Japan on the 8th of August and invaded Manchuria, shattering the Japanese Kwantung Army in days. Faced with annihilation from nuclear weapons and Soviet invasion, Emperor Hirohito overruled hardline military leaders and accepted Allied terms. On the 10th of August, Tokyo announced its willingness to surrender. On the 14th of August, the emperor addressed the Japanese people by radio, urging acceptance of the Potsdam terms. Representatives of Japan signed the instrument of surrender aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945. World War II, the deadliest conflict in history, was finally over. The end of the fighting did not bring immediate peace. Across Europe and Asia, societies grappled with devastation. Cities lay in ruins, fields were scorched, and millions of people were uprooted. Famine and disease stalked the continent. In Germany and Poland, Allied troops uncovered concentration camps and mass graves, revealing crimes that defied comprehension. Roughly 60 million people around the globe had perished: soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children. 6 million Jews and millions of others were murdered in the Holocaust. In the Soviet Union alone, more than 20 million died. In China, Japan's brutal occupation caused tens of millions of civilian casualties. Entire nations had been shattered. Yet from this ruin emerged new institutions and aspirations. The United Nations was established in 1945 with the stated goal of preventing future wars through collective security and diplomacy. Wartime allies began to rebuild shattered economies through initiatives like the Marshall Plan. Colonial empires crumbled as peoples in Asia and Africa demanded self-determination. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union soon hardened into the Cold War, with new alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact dividing the world. The atomic bomb introduced an age of nuclear weapons, prompting both terror and efforts at control. The campaigns between 1942 and 1945 show how quickly fortunes can change in war. They reveal the impact of decisive leadership, technological innovation, resource mobilization, and sheer human endurance. At El Alamein and Stalingrad, the tide turned against the Axis. In Sicily and Normandy, the Allies opened new fronts. In the Pacific, an island-hopping strategy carried American forces across oceans. At the Bulge and on Okinawa, tenacious resistance could not alter the ultimate outcome. And in New Mexico, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, science unleashed forces that ended one war and defined the dangers of the next. The Second World War's second act was a story of grinding campaigns and dramatic reversals. Its lessons continue to echo: that aggression can be checked, that alliances matter, that peace is fragile, and that humanity's capacity for both destruction and resilience is vast. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world breathed a sigh of relief. But the end of fighting did not bring quick return to normalcy. Cities from Rotterdam to Warsaw to Manila lay in rubble. Entire industries had been destroyed. Transport networks were in ruins. Tens of millions of people were homeless or displaced, wandering a landscape littered with minefields and skeletons of burned villages. In Europe alone, an estimated 11 million survivors had been uprooted from their homes, prisoners of war, forced laborers, refugees fleeing ethnic cleansing, and soldiers returning from the front. In Asia, from China to the Philippines, similar scenes of devastation unfolded. Families searched for relatives who had vanished into the chaos of war. Disease and malnutrition stalked the continent. The fighting might have ended, but suffering continued on a scale unimaginable just a decade earlier. Amid this wreckage, the world had to reckon not only with physical destruction, but also with the moral abyss revealed by the Holocaust. The war left an indelible mark on memory and would shape politics, society, and culture for decades to come. The liberation of concentration camps by Allied forces in 1944 and 1945 exposed atrocities that had been rumored but not fully believed. In Eastern Europe, Soviet troops were the first to stumble upon the machinery of mass murder. When they liberated Majdanek near Lublin in July 1944, they found barracks, gas chambers, and crematoria still intact, along with piles of shoes and personal belongings. Soon after, Auschwitz-Birkenau was discovered. It was the largest of the Nazi death camps, where more than 1.1 million men, women, and children had been murdered. The retreating SS had forced tens of thousands of prisoners on death marches. Only about 8,000 skeletal inmates were left behind when the Red Army arrived. American and British forces advancing from the west encountered similar horrors. At Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, they found heaps of corpses, emaciated survivors, and evidence of starvation, disease, and torture. General Dwight Eisenhower insisted that members of Congress and journalists witness these scenes so that no one could deny what had happened. These discoveries forced the world to confront the unprecedented crime of genocide. The Nazis had pursued a program of racial annihilation that targeted Jews, Roma, disabled people, Slavs, political dissidents, and others deemed undesirable. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers, but with legal discrimination and social exclusion. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship, banned intermarriage, and excluded them from professions. On the 9th of November 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, saw synagogues burned, Jewish businesses smashed, and thousands arrested. Following the 1939 invasion of Poland, Jews were forced into overcrowded ghettos where starvation and disease flourished. In the summer of 1941, as German armies invaded the Soviet Union, mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen began systematic mass shootings, murdering more than 1.5 million Jews and others. In January 1942, Nazi leaders gathered at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee to formalize the final solution, a plan to deport Europe's Jews to extermination camps built specifically for killing. By the end of the war, approximately 6 million Jewish people, alongside hundreds of thousands of Roma, millions of Soviet prisoners of war, and millions of others had been murdered. The full scale of the genocide gradually became public knowledge in the months after victory. Survivors testified to the horrors of selection, forced labor, experimentation, and starvation. They told of families torn apart on arrival at Auschwitz, of children ripped from their mothers' arms at Treblinka, of gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, and of ash blowing across nearby villages. Communities that had existed for centuries vanished. Entire cultures were extinguished. The names of places Auschwitz, Sobibor, Chelmno, Belzec became synonymous with industrialized death. The liberation of the camps galvanized humanitarian responses, including massive aid programs and the establishment of displaced persons DP camps, where survivors waited months or years to find new homes. Many Jewish survivors emigrated to Palestine, the United States, South America, and elsewhere, carrying with them trauma and the determination to rebuild their lives. The immensity of Nazi crimes raised pressing questions about accountability and justice. Even before the war ended, Allied leaders committed to prosecuting those responsible. The most famous of these efforts was the International Military Tribunal, IMT, convened in Nuremberg. Held in the Palace of Justice in the Bavarian city, the tribunal marked the first time an international court prosecuted leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 24 major Nazi figures and 7 organizations were indicted. 21 defendants actually stood trial. The prosecution presented thousands of documents, captured films, and eyewitness testimonies. The defendants, including Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Rudolf Hess, sat in the dock listening through headphones as simultaneous. Translation pioneered new techniques for multilingual justice. The judges came from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, reflecting the wartime alliance. In October 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdict. 12 men were sentenced to death, 3 to life imprisonment, 4 to long prison terms, and 3 were acquitted. Nuremberg was not the only arena for justice. American authorities conducted 12 subsequent trials in Nuremberg, targeting doctors who performed medical experiments, judges who enforced racial laws, industrialists who exploited slave labor, and SS leaders. Altogether, these U.S. military tribunals tried 177 defendants. 24 were sentenced to death and dozens to prison. Other Allied countries held their own proceedings, and millions of minor participants faced denazification measures, although these often amounted to questionnaire and fines. The Nuremberg Principles affirmed that individuals, not just states, could commit war crimes, that following orders was not a defense, and that heads of state were not immune from prosecution. These principles became foundational for later tribunals addressing crimes in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. In the Pacific Theater, a parallel tribunal was convened in Tokyo. Under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East tried 28 high-ranking Japanese officials. The trial, which lasted from May 1946 to November 1948, heard testimony from 419 witnesses and reviewed more than 4,000 exhibits. It focused on charges of initiating aggressive war and committing atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre. 7 defendants, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were sentenced to death. 16 received life imprisonment. Thousands of other Japanese officers and soldiers were tried in national courts across Asia. Critics noted that Emperor Hirohito was not indicted and that no Soviet personnel were charged for their own crimes. Nevertheless, the Tokyo trial reinforced the principle that wartime aggression and atrocity would not go unpunished. Even as tribunals prosecuted war criminals, governments and international organizations grappled with rebuilding economies and societies devastated by conflict. In Western Europe, the specter of economic collapse and communist expansion loomed large. In June 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall outlined a program to aid European recovery. Officially known as the European Recovery Program, but popularly called the Marshall Plan, it envisioned American grants and loans to rebuild industries, restore agriculture, and modernize infrastructure. The U.S. Congress appropriated funds that eventually totaled more than $12 billion, about $100 billion in today's currency, for 16 Western European countries. This influx of capital helped France, West Germany, Italy, and others rebuild factories, repair railroads, and stabilize currencies. It also stimulated U.S. exports and tied European economies closer to the United States. The Soviet Union and its satellite states were invited to participate but declined, citing concerns about sovereignty and seeing the program as an instrument of American influence. Moscow's refusal deepened the divide between East and West and accelerated the creation of rival economic blocs. Reconstruction was not just about money. At conferences in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July 1944, Allied nations created new financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to stabilize exchange rates and provide emergency loans, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, World Bank, to fund major infrastructure projects. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, reduced trade barriers, laying foundations for the World Trade Organization decades later. These institutions were designed to foster economic cooperation and prevent the beggar thy neighbor policies that had exacerbated the Great Depression. In Europe, the devastation of war also spurred integration. In 1951, 6 countries, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, created the European Coal and Steel Community. By pooling control of coal and steel, the raw materials of war, they hoped to make conflict not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. In 1957, the same 6 signed the Treaty of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community, a common market that would evolve into the European Union. Another major initiative addressed global governance, the United Nations. Delegates from 50 nations convened in San Francisco in April 1945 to write its charter. The UN aimed to maintain international peace and security, promote human rights, and foster social and economic development. It created a General Assembly representing all members and a Security Council with 5 permanent powers: the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, and China, each with veto power. The International Court of Justice provided a venue for resolving legal disputes between states. Perhaps most consequential was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948, drafted by a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. It set out a broad range of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Though not legally binding, the Declaration inspired numerous treaties and national constitutions, asserting that all people are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The war years had upended gender norms in many countries. With millions of men in uniform, women filled roles in factories, offices, and farms. In the United States, nearly 19 million women earned wages during the war, 5 million for the first time. They built aircraft, welded ships, operated machinery, and managed farms. Rosie the Riveter became an icon of female empowerment. Across the Atlantic, women in Britain served as air raid wardens, code breakers at Bletchley Park, and land girls on farms. Soviet women fought as snipers and pilots. Thousands of Chinese women joined guerrilla forces. After the war, many governments expected women to return to domestic roles. Employers laid off female workers to make room for returning servicemen, and social pressure encouraged them to resume housekeeping. Yet the experience had planted seeds of lasting change. Women who had proved their competence in traditionally male jobs now demanded equal pay and opportunities. More married women than single women continued to work, and by the 1950s, women's labor force participation remained above pre-war levels. The war also spurred legal reforms. French women gained suffrage in 1944, Italian women in 1945, Japanese women in 1946. In the United States, the GI Bill funded education and mortgages for millions of veterans, while African American veterans laid groundwork for the civil rights movement by demanding equality at home. Across the Pacific, Japan emerged from defeat under Allied occupation. Unlike Germany, which was divided among 4 occupying powers, Japan remained under unified command. General Douglas MacArthur wielded authority as supreme commander for the Allied powers, appeasement. He moved swiftly to demilitarize and democratize the country. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were dissolved, their weapons and ships scrapped. Military leaders, ultranationalists, and industrialists associated with aggression were purged from public life. Land reform redistributed millions of acres from landlords to tenant farmers, breaking the hold of feudal structures. The Zaibatsu massive conglomerates like Mitsui and Mitsubishi were broken up, though in practice, many reconstituted themselves later. Perhaps the most significant change was the new constitution promulgated in 1947, written by Allied staff but ratified by the Japanese Diet. It established a parliamentary democracy, guaranteed civil liberties and equality under the law, expanded women's rights, and renounced war as a sovereign right. Article 9 of the Constitution declared that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and that land, sea and air forces would never be maintained. Emperor Hirohito's role was reduced to that of a symbol of the state and of the unity of the people. Women gained the right to vote for the first time, and educational reforms promoted critical thinking over indoctrination. In 1948-49, as the Cold War intensified, U.S. policy shifted from punishment to rehabilitation. The reverse course relaxed purges and encouraged industrial growth to transform Japan into a bulwark against communism. The Korean War 1950-53 provided a major economic boost as Japanese factories supplied UN forces. In September 1951, the Treaty of San Francisco officially ended the state of war and restored Japanese sovereignty. A separate U.S.-Japan Security Treaty allowed American troops to remain and guaranteed Japan's defense. By the mid-1950s, Japan was on its way to becoming an economic powerhouse and a key U.S. ally in Asia. The war also cracked the foundations of colonial empires. European powers, weakened economically and militarily, faced mounting demands for independence across Asia and Africa. Independence movements drew inspiration from wartime rhetoric about freedom and self-determination, and many leaders of anti-colonial struggle had fought against the Japanese or learned guerrilla tactics in the war. Between 1945 and 1960, more than 36 new states emerged. The process unfolded unevenly. Some colonies negotiated peaceful transfers of power, while others waged protracted wars. In South Asia, the end of British rule came with a traumatic partition. In August 1947, Britain withdrew from India, creating two dominions, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. Amid the euphoria of independence, communal violence exploded. Within weeks, 10 million Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs crossed newly drawn borders in one of the largest migrations in history. Mobs attacked caravans and trains, burning villages and slaughtering travelers. Estimates of the dead range from 200,000 to 1 million. Refugee camps overflowed. Families were separated forever. The new government struggled to assert control. The partition sowed seeds of enduring hostility, leading to wars in 1947, 1965, 1971, and beyond. Elsewhere in Asia, independence movements gained momentum. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence from France, quoting the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The French, unwilling to relinquish their colony, fought a guerrilla war that would evolve into the First Indochina War. In Indonesia, nationalist leader Sukarno proclaimed independence on the 17th of August 1945. Dutch attempts to reassert control were met with armed resistance, and after 4 years of conflict and diplomatic pressure, including U.S. mediation, the Netherlands recognized Indonesian sovereignty. In 1949, Burma, now Myanmar, gained independence in 1948 after negotiations. The Philippines became independent from the United States in 1946. British, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia followed. Across the Middle East, Syria and Lebanon shed French mandates. Jordan gained independence. And in 1948, the British mandate in Palestine ended with the declaration of the State of Israel. The ensuing Arab-Israeli War saw 5 Arab nations attack the new state. By the time armistices were signed in 1949, Israel held more territory than envisioned in the UN partition plan. Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip and Jordan annexed the West Bank. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled, creating a refugee crisis that persists today. In Africa, independence came slightly later but gained momentum through the 1950s and 1960s. Ghana, under Kwame Nkrumah, became the first sub-Saharan colony to gain independence in 1957. Algeria fought a bloody war against France beginning in 1954. The Mau uprising in Kenya, revolts in Egypt's Suez Canal zone, and protests in South Africa signaled a continent in flux. Decolonization transformed the United Nations, whose membership expanded from 51 countries in 1945 to 127 by 1970. Each new state brought its own priorities and struggles, reshaping global politics. While colonial empires crumbled, another revolutionary upheaval transformed the world's most populous nation. China had been embroiled in a civil war between the nationalist Kuomintang KMT and the Communist Party since the 1920s. During World War II, they formed a tenuous alliance against Japanese invasion. After Japan's surrender, the truce collapsed. Communist forces under Mao Zedong gained support in the countryside, promising land reform and an end to corruption. Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, backed by U.S. aid, controlled cities and coastal regions but faced rampant inflation and declining morale. The Communists employed guerrilla warfare and political indoctrination to win hearts and minds. By 1949, they had captured Beijing and were sweeping south. On the 1st of October 1949, Mao stood atop the gate of heavenly peace in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. Chiang and about 2 million supporters fled to the island of Taiwan, where they maintained the Republic of China government. The United States refused to recognize the new regime for decades, while the Soviets heralded China as a partner in the socialist camp. The revolution transformed East Asian geopolitics, setting the stage for the Korean War and later the Sino-Soviet split. In June 1950, the fragile peace in Korea shattered when North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The Korean peninsula had been divided at the end of World War II. Soviet troops occupied the north, while U.S. forces accepted the surrender of Japanese forces in the south. Negotiations for unification stalled as separate governments took root. When North Korean leader Kim Il-sung launched his surprise attack, he aimed to reunify the peninsula by force. The United Nations Security Council, with the Soviet delegate absent, passed resolutions condemning the invasion and calling on member states to assist. The United States assembled a coalition of 16 nations under UN command. General MacArthur, commanding U.S. and South Korean troops, conducted a daring amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950 that severed North Korean supply lines and recaptured Seoul. The offensive then pushed north toward the Yalu River bordering China. China, alarmed at the prospect of hostile forces on its frontier, intervened. In late October, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers crossed into North Korea, launching human wave attacks that drove UN forces back. The winter of 1950-51 was brutal. Fighting seesawed across the peninsula, inflicting heavy casualties on both sides. MacArthur advocated bombing Chinese bases and even threatened nuclear strikes. President Truman relieved him of command, emphasizing civilian control of the military. By mid-1951, the war settled into a bloody stalemate near the original dividing line. Armistice talks dragged on for 2 years, with disagreements over prisoner repatriation. Finally, on the 27th of July 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. It created a demilitarist zone roughly along the 38th parallel, left Korea divided, and ended active fighting but not the war itself. The conflict killed an estimated 3 million people, including hundreds of thousands of civilians. It set the pattern for proxy wars during the Cold War and cemented the U.S. commitment to containing communism in Asia. The years immediately after World War II saw the rapid crystallization of opposing blocs. In March 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman asked Congress to support Greece and Turkey against perceived communist threats, articulating what became known as the Truman Doctrine. He declared that it must be U.S. policy to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. The doctrine signaled a shift from wartime alliance to containment of Soviet expansion. In April 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty. It committed members to consider an attack on one as an attack on all, and established a peacetime military alliance for the first time in U.S. history. 2 years later, Greece and Turkey joined. In 1955, West Germany entered NATO, prompting the Soviet Union to create the Warsaw Pact as a counterbalance.
At the same time, the arms race began. In August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, ending the US monopoly on nuclear weapons. Both superpowers embarked on programs to develop hydrogen bombs, orders of magnitude more powerful. Nuclear strategy and deterrence became central to geopolitics. Civil defense drills and bomb shelters entered everyday life in many countries. Popular culture reflected fear of annihilation and fascination with atomic power. Meanwhile, espionage flourished. Cases like the Cambridge Five in the United Kingdom and the conviction of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in the United States heightened paranoia. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy exploited this climate, launching a campaign that accused government employees and cultural figures of communist sympathies, leading to careers ruined by blacklisting. The global upheaval of war and the contradictions of democratic rhetoric and discriminatory practice sparked social change movements. African American soldiers who had fought racism abroad returned to segregation at home. In 1948, President Truman desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces by executive order, paving the way for broader civil rights reforms. Veterans used the GI Bill to attend college, buy homes, and start businesses. These opportunities were not distributed equally. Discriminatory lending and housing practices excluded many black veterans, sowing seeds of later struggles. In Britain, the arrival of Caribbean migrants on the Empire Windrush in 1948 marked the beginning of a multicultural society, while resistance to colonial rule abroad inspired activism at home. Across Europe and America, artists, writers, and filmmakers processed wartime trauma and explored themes of guilt, memory, and renewal. Films like The Third Man, literature like Anne Frank, S. Diary, and the works of Primo Levi and Nawal el-Saadawi gave voice to survivors and questioned what it meant to rebuild after unspeakable horrors. World War II was not simply another conflict. It was a rupture that forced humanity to rethink the rules of war and the responsibilities of nations. The revelation of genocide led to the Genocide Convention of 1948 and new Geneva Conventions in 1949 defining the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials laid the groundwork for later international courts, reconstruction programs, and new financial institutions established structures for global economic cooperation. Decolonization redrew the map of the world and added dozens of new voices to international forums. The Cold War created a perilous balance of power that would dominate politics for the next 4 decades, while the Korean War demonstrated the potential for regional conflicts to become proxy wars between superpowers. This period also forced societies to confront memory. In Germany, reckoning with Nazism and the Holocaust became a long and painful process. In Japan, debate over wartime aggression and victimhood continues. Survivors of death camps, atomic bombings, and battlefield atrocities struggled to tell their stories in the face of trauma and denial. Monuments, museums, and memorial days were established to educate future generations. The term "never again" gained currency, though preventing genocide remained an ongoing challenge. As the 1950s progressed, the world was firmly in the grip of a new bipolar order, yet the seeds of later change had been sown. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights declared that all humans are born with rights that governments must respect. Women who had entered factories during the war began campaigns for equal pay and opportunities. Colonized peoples insisted that European promises of self-determination apply to them. Artists and intellectuals grappled with existential questions raised by genocide and atomic warfare. Amid the rubble and rationing, there was also hope. Hope that the new institutions, created after the war, could succeed where the League of Nations had failed. Hope that nations could cooperate across ideological divides. Hope that lessons learned at such terrible cost would guide future generations.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, much of the globe lay in ruin. Europe had become a landscape of broken walls and shattered lives, where more than 30 million people had been displaced. Entire cities like Warsaw, Dresden, and Stalingrad were reduced to smoldering rubble, their skylines erased and their communities scattered. The war had not only destroyed buildings, but had also broken the spirit of empires that once claimed to rule the world. Yet, amid the devastation, something new was stirring. The war had been fought in the name of freedom, in the name of democracy, in the name of self-determination. Those words, repeated endlessly in propaganda and speeches, had not been forgotten by the millions who lived under colonial rule. For decades, peoples across Asia and Africa had supplied soldiers, resources, and sweat to fuel the wars of Europe. Now they asked, with growing determination, why they should continue to bow to distant masters. The old colonial order was crumbling, and its collapse would shape the second half of the 20th century as powerfully as the war itself. One of the earliest and most dramatic upheavals came in South Asia. Britain, exhausted and unable to maintain its empire, announced that India would become independent in the summer of 1947. But instead of one great state rising from the colony, the land was torn in two. The borders drawn on maps by hurried officials became scars across villages, provinces, and families. On the 15th of August, India and Pakistan emerged into the world, one Hindu majority, the other Muslim majority. Their populations forced to choose allegiance at the cost of blood. 10 million people fled across the hastily drawn lines, and violence followed in their wake. Trains arrived at stations filled not with passengers but with corpses. Fields and streets became killing grounds. As many as 1 million perished in the frenzy, with the Punjab province enduring some of the worst atrocities. The new states were born amid both triumph and horror, and their painful birth foreshadowed the troubled path of decolonization in other corners of the globe. The collapse of British India was the first in a wave. In Southeast Asia, insurgents who had fought the Japanese occupation did not simply lay down their arms when the war ended. Instead, they turned their weapons against their old colonial masters. In Indonesia, the Dutch attempted to reassert control, only to face a determined independence movement that led to a bitter 4-year conflict. By 1949, the Netherlands conceded and recognized Indonesian independence. In Indochina, France faced its own nightmare. Determined to rebuild its prestige, it tried to reclaim Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But resistance under Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh sparked a war that dragged on for years, eventually entangling not only France but later the United States. In the Middle East, Britain withdrew from Palestine in 1948, leaving behind a land fractured by rival claims. Jewish leaders declared the creation of the State of Israel, and the region was immediately engulfed in war with Arab neighbors. Across the globe, it became clear that the empire was no longer a gift Europe could bestow. Freedom had to be fought for, seized, and defended. While empires fractured, the victors of the war looked for ways to ensure such devastation would never occur again. In the spring of 1945, delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco. Their goal was ambitious: to create a new international body capable of preserving peace. Out of weeks of negotiation emerged the United Nations. Unlike the League of Nations, whose weakness had been exposed in the 1930s, this new organization carried the weight of the world's strongest powers. An Assembly of Nations was created to debate global issues, and a Security Council was established with authority to act against threats to peace. Alongside it came the International Court of Justice to arbitrate disputes among nations. In 1948, the world took another bold step: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a direct answer to the horrors of the Holocaust and the atrocities of war, a document proclaiming that all human beings possessed fundamental rights and freedoms. For the first time, humanity tried to set down a universal standard for dignity, equality, and justice. Though its promises would often be broken, the Declaration stood as a moral compass for generations to come. But even as leaders pledged unity, divisions were already widening. The wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers was unraveling. By 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe. On one side stood the communist regimes installed by the Soviet Union. On the other, the fragile democracies of the West. Suspicion and fear poisoned diplomacy. The confrontation over Berlin in 1948 brought the rivalry into sharp focus. Determined to force the West out of the city, Stalin blockaded all land routes. For nearly a year, planes from the United States and Britain flew day and night, delivering food and fuel to the 2 million residents of West Berlin. At its height, A plane landed every few minutes, a massive aerial lifeline that symbolized defiance and unity. When the blockade was finally lifted in May 1949, the lines of the Cold War had hardened beyond repair. The growing menace of Soviet expansion inspired new alliances. In April 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, pledging that an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. NATO, as it became known, tied the United States permanently to Europe's defense. Billions of dollars in military aid flowed to strengthen Western armies, while Greece, Turkey, and later West Germany joined the alliance. In response, the Soviet Union created its own military pact, drawing Eastern Europe into a rival camp. The world was no longer united by victory. It was divided into two camps, staring at each other across barbed wire and watchtowers. The rivalry reached terrifying new heights with the advent of nuclear weapons. In August 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, shattering America's monopoly. Just 3 years later, the United States unveiled a weapon of almost unimaginable power, the hydrogen bomb. Detonated in the Pacific, it produced an explosion many hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Entire islands vanished in the blast, replaced by a bubbling crater of ocean. Within months, the Soviet Union responded with its own thermonuclear device. The nuclear arms race had begun. From that moment, the fate of humanity hung on arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. Fear of annihilation became the background noise of daily life, influencing politics, culture, and even childhood drills in schools. While the superpowers armed themselves, another vast nation was undergoing a revolution of its own. In October 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Beijing and proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China. After years of brutal civil war, the communists had triumphed, and the defeated nationalists retreated to Taiwan. For the United States, which had backed Chiang Kai-shek, the loss of China was a profound shock. It seemed to confirm fears that communism was spreading relentlessly. Western policymakers spoke of a domino effect where one nation after another might fall. Asia, once the battleground of empires, was now a central front in the global struggle between East and West. The Korean Peninsula soon proved how explosive this rivalry had become. Divided at the end of World War II along the 38th parallel, Korea was a fragile construct, half communist, half capitalist. In June 1950, the line was shattered when North Korean troops poured southward, aiming to unify the country by force. The United Nations, led by American forces, rushed to defend the South. In a daring move, General Douglas MacArthur launched an amphibious landing at Incheon, turning the tide and pushing the North Korean army back to the Chinese border. But victory was fleeting. Alarmed by the advance, China unleashed hundreds of thousands of troops, driving UN forces back into a bloody stalemate. For 3 years, the front line shifted back and forth, villages destroyed and families torn apart, until an armistice in July 1953 left the peninsula divided much as it had been before. 3 million lives had been lost, and the war served as a grim warning. Proxy wars between the superpowers would be fought not in their own homelands, but in the lands of others. In Japan, the defeat had brought occupation rather than division. Under the guidance of General MacArthur, sweeping reforms transformed the country. The military was dismantled, vast industrial conglomerates were broken up, and land was redistributed. A new constitution stripped the emperor of political power and enshrined democratic freedoms, including unprecedented rights for women. What had been a militarist empire was reshaped into a pacifist democracy. By the early 1950s, however, America's goals shifted. With communism advancing in Asia, the priority became economic recovery and stability. The Treaty of San Francisco formally ended the war and allowed American troops to remain on Japanese soil as allies. When the Korean War erupted, Japan became a crucial logistical base, accelerating its economic revival. Within 2 decades, the nation that had once been devastated by bombs had risen as an economic giant, its factories humming, its exports flooding the world. The Middle East was no less turbulent. As the British Mandate in Palestine ended, Jewish leaders declared the State of Israel in May 1948. Neighboring Arab states launched an invasion, sparking a war that left Israel not only intact but enlarged. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled, creating a refugee crisis that has endured for generations. The lines drawn then, Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, became the seeds of conflicts that would reverberate through the century, entwined with Cold War politics and regional rivalries. In Africa, the tide of decolonization gathered force. The 1950s saw uprisings, negotiations, and fragile steps toward independence. By 1960, often called the Year of Africa, 17 new nations declared sovereignty, from Nigeria to Congo to Côte d'Ivoire. Others, such as Ghana and Guinea, had led the way earlier. Some transitions were achieved through negotiation. Others came at terrible cost. In Algeria, a bitter war of independence against France would rage until the early 1960s, leaving deep scars on both sides. In Kenya, the Momo Uprising challenged British rule, bringing brutal repression and bloodshed. Yet despite the struggles, the momentum was irreversible. The map of Africa was being redrawn, and with it, the global balance of power. The war had not only redrawn borders, but had also reshaped societies. In factories and offices across the world, women had stepped into roles once reserved for men. In the United States, millions of women joined the workforce, symbolized by the figure of Rosie the Riveter. Many were laid off when peace returned, but the experience had changed them and planted the seeds for future feminist movements. In Europe and Asia, women had served as partisans, pilots, nurses, and guerrilla fighters, proving that they too could bear the burdens of war. Their contributions challenged centuries of tradition and broadened expectations for what women could achieve. Meanwhile, Europe faced the daunting task of rebuilding its shattered economies. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced a sweeping plan to provide aid. Billions of dollars flowed across the Atlantic, fueling the reconstruction of factories, farms, and cities. The Marshall Plan did more than feed the hungry or restart industry. It bound Western Europe together and tied it firmly to the United States. Out of this cooperation grew new institutions of unity. France, Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries joined in managing coal and steel, the vital resources of war. By 1957, the Treaty of Rome created the European Economic Community, a foundation for what would one day become the European Union. The hope was simple but profound. By binding economies together, future wars could be made not only unlikely but impossible. As the world looked forward, it also looked back in judgment. The Nuremberg trials sought to hold Nazi leaders accountable for crimes of aggression and genocide. In a courtroom packed with evidence and survivors, The atrocities of the Holocaust were laid bare. 24 leading figures of the Third Reich faced justice, 12 of them sentenced to death. Hundreds more were convicted in subsequent trials. In Tokyo, Japanese leaders faced their own tribunal, with dozens sentenced to death or life imprisonment. These trials established precedents that echoed through history, that leaders could be held personally accountable, that crimes against humanity would not be forgotten, and that the word genocide would become a permanent scar in humanity's conscience. The years following World War II were thus years of paradox. The old empires crumbled, but new superpowers arose to dominate the globe. The hope of peace gave birth to the United Nations, but fear of destruction produced a nuclear arms race. Nations won independence, yet found themselves caught in the crossfire of the Cold War. Societies opened new doors for women and minorities, yet faced the burden of rebuilding from ashes. Justice was sought for the crimes of the past, even as new conflicts erupted in Korea, Palestine, and Indochina. The legacy of those years remains with us still. From the rubble of bombed cities rose the frameworks of international cooperation. From the horrors of genocide emerged the language of human rights. And from the collapse of empires came a chorus of new nations demanding equality on the world stage. But there was also fear, the fear of nuclear annihilation, the fear of ideological domination, the fear that peace was fragile and temporary. The Second World War had ended, but its shadow stretched long into the decades that followed. And as humanity stepped into this new world, one truth became clear. The struggle for a more just, peaceful, and united planet was not finished in 1945. It is, even now, a struggle that continues with every generation. By the mid-1950s, the world lived in the shadow of weapons too powerful to comprehend. The Cold War simmered and flared, sometimes quiet and tense, other times burning hot with crisis. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was more than politics. It was a contest of survival. Both sides had harnessed the atom, and by the end of the decade, each superpower possessed hydrogen bombs, 1,000 times more destructive than the ones that had leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Humanity had entered an age where a single miscalculation could end civilization in a flash of light and fire. Nowhere was this reality felt more keenly than in October of 1962. On the shores of Cuba, American U-2 spy planes photographed construction sites that revealed a terrible truth. Soviet missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads were being installed just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world held its breath. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy and his advisors debated invasion, blockade, or diplomacy. In Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev weighed whether to retreat or risk nuclear war. Ordinary people listened to radios in fear. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in schools, and families wondered if they would live to see another sunrise. At the brink, private letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev opened a narrow path to peace. The missiles were withdrawn, and catastrophe was averted. But the Cuban Missile Crisis seared itself into collective memory as the moment humanity came closest to destroying itself. The brush with annihilation forced both sides to seek a measure of restraint. Less than a year later, on the 5th of August, 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in Moscow. For the first time, nations agreed to prohibit nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Testing could continue underground, but only if no radioactive debris crossed borders. On the 10th of October, the treaty took effect, and in time, more than 120 nations would join. It was a modest step, but a historic one, the first acknowledgement that nuclear power could not remain entirely unchecked. Even as treaties were signed, Europe continued to tremble under Cold War tension. In 1956, Hungary erupted in revolt. Students and workers filled the streets of Budapest, demanding freedom from Moscow's grip and calling for reforms. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Hungary might break free. But Soviet tanks rolled in, crushing the uprising with ruthless force. Thousands died, and tens of thousands fled into exile. The lesson was brutal. Within the Soviet sphere, defiance was not tolerated. 5 years later, another crisis unfolded in Germany. Since the end of the war, millions of East Germans had fled through the open border of Berlin, escaping to the West in search of freedom and opportunity. To stop the hemorrhage, East German authorities, backed by Moscow, began constructing a wall in August 1961. Overnight, barbed wire cut through neighborhoods, streets, even families. Soon the wire became concrete, watchtowers, and machine guns. The Berlin Wall stood as the starkest symbol of division, a visible scar of the Iron Curtain. Attempts to cross it ended in tragedy for many, their deaths a haunting reminder of the price of repression. And yet, beneath the surface, dissent smoldered. In 1968, reformers in Czechoslovakia launched a bold experiment to create socialism with a human face. For months, Prague blossomed with free speech and new ideas. But in August, Warsaw-packed armies invaded, rolling their tanks through the streets and crushing the hopes of millions. Once again, Soviet power proved unyielding, though each uprising foreshadowed a future reckoning that would eventually sweep away communist regimes at the close of the century. While Europe remained divided, the tide of decolonization surged ahead across the global south. By the mid-1960s, nearly all of Asia's former colonies had secured independence, from India and Pakistan to Indonesia and Vietnam. In Africa, liberation movements advanced relentlessly. The landmark year of 1960 saw 17 nations, including Nigeria, Niger, Chad, the Congo, and Côte d'Ivoire, declare independence. Algeria, after a brutal war that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, finally broke free of French rule in 1962. Kenya, after years of resistance and repression, emerged as a new nation in 1963. Zambia and Malawi followed in 1964, and others soon after. By 1970, the United Nations had expanded from just 35 states in 1946 to more than 127 members, a living testament to the dismantling of colonial empires. Yet independence was not the end of struggle. Many new states faced grinding poverty, fragile borders, and the interference of Cold War powers who sought allies in their great global chess match. Still, the political map of the world had been permanently redrawn. Centuries of European dominance were over. The currents of change were not confined to distant colonies. Within the United States, veterans of the Second World War returned home, unwilling to accept the hypocrisy of fighting fascism abroad while enduring segregation at home. African American soldiers, who had worn the uniform of freedom, became leaders in the battle for civil rights. Their determination, combined with the courage of women, students, and activists of every background, launched a movement that would transform America. Marches filled the streets of Washington, Montgomery, and Birmingham. Voices like Martin Luther King Jr. rang out, demanding justice, equality, and the fulfillment of promises long denied. Slowly, painfully, laws changed. Segregation crumbled, voting rights expanded, and the world saw a superpower confronting its own contradictions. In Europe, too, societies shifted. Migrants from colonies arrived in London, Paris, and Amsterdam, bringing with them cultures that enriched and challenged their new homes. Women who had labored in wartime factories were reluctant to return quietly to domestic life. Though many were pushed back into lower-paid jobs, their wartime experience had cracked the mold of expectation. By the 1960s, a second wave of feminism was gathering strength. Students marched against wars, citizens demanded cleaner air and water, and environmentalism began to take root. New movements, civil rights, feminism, anti-war protests, and ecological campaigns emerged as heirs to the unfinished struggles of the Second World War. Amid unrest, the superpowers sought ways to ease confrontation. By the late 1960s, the term détente entered the vocabulary of diplomats. Strategic arms limitation talks began, producing agreements to restrict anti-ballistic missile systems and to slow the growth of nuclear stockpiles. The accords were imperfect and fragile, but they reflected an acknowledgement that full-scale war would bring nothing but mutual annihilation. On the streets, ordinary citizens joined peace marches, raised their voices against nuclear proliferation, and demanded that leaders step back from the brink. Behind the Iron Curtain, dissidents risked everything to call for freedom, while in the West, activists insisted their governments respect human rights as fiercely as they resisted communism. At the same time, a movement of remembrance took shape. Survivors of the Holocaust, historians, and educators dedicated their lives to preserving the memory of the atrocities that had scarred the world. Memorials were built, from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem to the preserved barracks and gates of Auschwitz. These places became classrooms of conscience, reminders of what humanity is capable of when hatred is given free rein. In time, the United Nations would establish an International Holocaust Remembrance Day, chosen on January 27th to mark the liberation of Auschwitz. Each year, ceremonies would honor the victims, and teachers would remind their students that forgetting is the first step toward repeating. The legacy of the Second World War remained inescapable. It had destroyed old empires and birthed new nations. It had unleashed the nuclear age, inaugurating a Cold War that threatened to obliterate all life. It had spurred humanity to draft universal declarations of rights and to prosecute crimes against humanity in tribunals that set new standards of justice. Its ripple effects were felt in every corner of the globe, in the design of international institutions, in the shifting borders on maps, in the movements for equality, and in the fears that haunted the nuclear standoff. To remember the war is not only to mourn the dead, but to understand the living. The struggles for freedom, justice, and dignity that defined the 1940s did not end in 1945. They continued in Montgomery, in Budapest, in Algiers, in Prague, and in countless other places where people demanded their voices be heard. The war's echoes shaped the long peace that followed, a peace fragile and imperfect, yet one that endured for decades in spite of crises. The choices made in the aftermath, whether to build walls or bridges, to stockpile weapons or sign treaties, to exclude or to include, were choices that defined generations. Today, its lessons remain urgent. The institutions created, the rights declared, and the memories preserved were all born from the fire of the Second World War. To forget them is to risk repeating the mistakes that led to catastrophe. To honor them is to carry forward the unfinished struggle for a more just and peaceful world. The war's shadow stretches still across our time, reminding us that vigilance is the price of freedom and that the path to cooperation is never guaranteed. This is the conclusion of the story. The conflict that began with the gathering storm in the late 1930s, that erupted into global war, that revealed the horrors of genocide, and that reshaped nations in its aftermath, has carried its echoes deep into our present. The 5 chapters of this narrative, from outbreak to battles to liberation to rebuilding, and now to the long echoes of war, form a single arc. It is the story of the most destructive conflict in human history, but also of humanity's resilience, creativity, and determination to rise from the ashes. To listen to this story is to remember not only what was lost, but what was gained, the possibility of unity, the strength of ideals, and the reminder that the choices of one generation shape the lives of the next.